They say every giant vessel begins its life with fanfare, an unveiling of steel and promise. Yet the final act for many of these maritime behemoths plays out on a remote beach in Pakistan, where the work is dangerous, the oversight is weak, and the real story is hidden behind layers of secrecy. At first glance, Gdani Beach looks unremarkable. You might spot fishermen casting nets into the surf, or children running barefoot across the sand. But scan the horizon, and an unsettling scene emerges. Towering, half-dismantled ships lying on their sides, their hulls flayed open like enormous steel carcasses. Cranes groan under the weight of rusted beams, while workers in torn clothing scamper across the decks, wielding blowtorches that rain molten sparks into the ocean breeze. Few know the scale of what unfolds here. Gdani is one of the world's largest shipbreaking hubs, where oil tankers, cargo carriers, and once lavish cruise liners come to be ripped apart for scrap metal. From afar, a ship might seem like an elegant masterpiece of engineering, but up close, the reality is stark. Chipped paint harboring toxic chemicals, endless tangles of frayed wiring in compartments that reek of old fuel. Some of these vessels bear well-known names from their previous lives of hauling cargo across the Atlantic or ferrying gleeful holidaymakers around tropical islands. By the time they arrive on this beach, their storied histories are reduced to massive, rotting shells, destined for little more than a final, brutal demolition. Work here begins before sunrise. Under the faint glow of flickering floodlights, men file into the yard, rummaging for any piece of protective gear they can find. Often, that amounts to a scrap of cloth tied around the mouth, or perhaps layers of taped-up footwear. Their tools are basic: sledgehammers, acetylene torches, and sometimes saws with dull blades. The rudimentary equipment goes hand in hand with the meager wages, on average around $4 a day. For many, it's the only income they've ever known. Some traveled hundreds of miles from remote regions of Pakistan, lured by the promise of consistent work at a place rumored to employ thousands. Whether it's rumor or truth hardly matters once they arrive. The owners give them a job, a bunk in a cramped dorm or shack, and if they're lucky, a single day off each week. Peering into the skeleton of a beached cruise liner can be a surreal experience. Echoes of laughter and music from its former life exist only in memory. Where once guests sipped cocktails by an extravagant pool, now workers stand on corroded metal decks, prying off layers of insulation. Rust clings to every surface. In some corners, the ceiling has collapsed entirely. Despite the grim surroundings, there's urgency. Every chunk of steel or salvageable fixture translates into money. Separate the copper from the steel, the brass from the aluminum, and cart it off in truckloads. Nothing is wasted if it can still turn a profit. Even battered wooden furnishings find second lives in local markets. A desk that once graced a captain's cabin might end up in a roadside stall, sold for a fraction of its original cost. This place is no secret to industry insiders. For decades, international shipping companies have eyed South Asian beaches, Pakistan, India, and Bangladesh in particular, for their final disposals. It all comes down to cost. Dismantling a ship in Europe or North America comes with strict regulations, expensive labor, and environmental oversight that can cut deeply into profits. But if the ship is sent to a country where standards are less stringently enforced, the profit margin can soar. That financial lure is the root of Gdani's attraction. Cheap labor, fewer safety requirements, and the ability to operate away from prying eyes. Yet questions of legality and ethics hover like a dark cloud. International laws technically restrict the dumping of toxic vessels in places without the infrastructure to handle hazardous waste. But shipping firms excel at finding loopholes. By registering a ship under a flag of convenience, a nation whose maritime regulations are notoriously lax, they obscure the vessel's true ownership. Then, by routing the ship through multiple ports, they sidestep direct accountability. The original owners wash their hands of the matter, claiming they sold the vessel legally, and the new registrants sometimes produce fraudulent paperwork, declaring the ship to be free of harmful substances. By the time it runs aground in Gdani, any direct trail back to the real decision-makers is as tangled as the steel cables left on the beach. The average viewer of this spectacle might find it hard to imagine the layers of danger stacked against the men working here. There is the immediate threat of a fatal accident. A severed hull section can weigh thousands of tons, and if it collapses unexpectedly, there's nowhere to run on the slippery decks. Reports circulate of entire teams crushed beneath falling steel plates with little chance of rescue. Then there are the toxins. Many older ships are laced with asbestos in their insulation, alongside lead paint, residual fuel, and other chemicals that can seep into the air and water. Workers often have no idea what they're inhaling, and by the time health problems surface, the link to shipbreaking is all but forgotten. Local authorities frequently promise reforms. Inspections are announced, improvements are pledged, and for a short while, it appears as though the yard owners might be forced to offer safer conditions. But enforcement is sporadic, and corruption allegations are rife. Rumors abound that some inspectors accept bribes or look the other way, as the shipbreaking industry is a significant source of tax revenue. Indeed, dismantling even a single large tanker generates millions in raw materials, from steel beams to copper wiring, feeding local steel mills and hardware suppliers. It's an economic driver that the region is hesitant to lose, no matter the human cost. Veteran workers share stories that are difficult to verify but impossible to dismiss. They speak of nights when no one was allowed to leave the yard because a major accident had occurred, and management wanted the place cleared before dawn. Sometimes families of the fallen receive a small payout in exchange for signing documents that waive any legal claims. Other times, they don't hear from their loved ones at all, left to wonder what fate befell them in a distant coastal yard far from home. The fear of losing a job discourages most people from speaking out. After all, who would hire them back in their impoverished villages if they revealed too much about the yard's darkest secrets? Beyond Gdani, the global conversation about shipbreaking is heating up. Environmental watchdogs have long criticized the practice of beaching, which involves running a ship onto a shoreline so it can be dismantled without the use of specialized dry docks. They argue that much of the vessel's toxic residue seeps into the sand and water, wreaking havoc on local ecosystems. Marine life suffers the effects of oil, heavy metals, and microscopic plastic fibers. Fishermen complain of declining catches, while health officials worry about the contaminated seafood entering local markets. For a population already grappling with inadequate healthcare, these hidden hazards only compound the region's struggles. A new beacon of hope, or so it's called, lies in the Hong Kong Convention, an international treaty designed to make ship recycling safer. Slated to come into force in June 2025, it requires vessels to maintain an accurate inventory of hazardous materials and mandates that receiving yards demonstrate safe disposal measures. Critics, however, note that the convention was heavily influenced by the shipping industry itself. They suspect it might serve as a convenient greenwashing tool rather than a genuine solution. If yards are able to produce the right paperwork, does anyone verify their actual conditions on the ground? The shipping companies might tout compliance, but what if the same old unsafe practices continue behind closed gates? India, Bangladesh, and Turkey have made efforts to update their yards, at least nominally, under the watchful gaze of international observers. Pakistan, on the other hand, has been slower to act. While officials have claimed they will upgrade Gdani's facilities, few tangible changes have occurred, raising doubts about whether compliance will mean anything other than a few cosmetic tweaks and official stamps. For workers, the question remains, will any of these new rules actually save lives, or will they just offer cover for the same deadly cycle to roll on? In these yards, talk of compliance and treaties feels distant. Each day's labor is a battlefield where men face both physical and invisible enemies. One day, a young worker might be assigned to cut apart a steel frame several stories high. He climbs up with no harness, no protective gloves, feeling the scorching sun beat down. In the distance, he hears a scream, a crash, or perhaps just the wind against the rusting hull. He has a family to feed, so he keeps cutting. The money will never be enough to lift him out of poverty, but it might keep him from destitution. When shifts end, he might collapse into a rickety bunk, inhaling the fumes of burnt metal that still cling to his clothes. Nearby, older workers might be chatting over a meal, trading stories about explosions or fires that ravaged certain yards in the past. They recall how many perished, how many were simply never seen again. One of the worst incidents took place in 2016 when an oil tanker exploded during dismantling. Witnesses described flames shooting high into the sky, thick columns of black smoke visible for miles, and the harrowing cries of men trapped inside compartments. Government figures say at least 29 lives were lost, but activists argue the real number was likely higher. Some survivors, disfigured by burns, spoke out in interviews, only to vanish from public view soon after. The tragedy prompted fresh promises of safety reforms, fire drills, better training, stricter rules about how to handle flammable materials. The yard owners assured everyone that conditions would improve, and for a time, it seemed like they might. Then the international headlines died down, and so did much of the reformists' zeal. Today, if you speak to workers on the ground, they'll say little has changed besides the occasional presence of extra security guards to keep prying cameras away. Economists in the region sometimes argue that shipbreaking, despite its hazards, is a necessary industry for a developing nation. The recycled steel is used in construction projects from bridges to apartment complexes, reducing the reliance on imported metal. The entire chain, from hauling the scrap onto trucks to melting it down in furnaces, employs thousands of people in supporting industries. Without that influx of raw materials, the argument goes, the national economy could suffer. It's a point that resonates in areas where poverty is widespread and government resources are thin. But does that justify the human cost? Cultural factors also play a role. In some of the remote areas workers come from, job prospects are scarce. Education is minimal, and day-to-day survival often depends on finding any form of employment. Young men might hear stories from returning laborers who, despite the dangers, managed to earn enough to buy a piece of land or to send younger siblings to school. The dream of that extra income can overshadow the ominous tales of injuries and exploitation. By the time they see Gdani for themselves, the reality might not match the dream. But turning back empty-handed is seldom an option. At the heart of it all is a question of accountability. Who truly bears responsibility for each beached ship and each human life reduced to a statistic? Is it the original shipowner who decided to sell off the vessel? The flag state that allowed the ship's registry under suspicious circumstances? The Pakistani authorities who either fail to enforce the rules or actively look the other way? Or perhaps the yard owners who profit handsomely while giving workers minimal pay and substandard equipment? Activists argue that blame should be shared across the entire supply chain, including the wealthy nations that benefit from cheaper steel, without having to deal with the industrial waste in their own backyards. Meanwhile, day breaks again on Gdani Beach. Heavy machinery rumbles to life, torches spark, and sparks shower down in a brilliant but deadly display. The tide rolls in, mixing with oil slicks and shards of metal. Farther inland, trucks wait in long rows, ready to transport the dismantled ship parts to reprocessing plants. Families of workers might stand on the roadside, hoping for a word with a father, brother, or son who emerges covered in sweat and soot at the end of his shift. He might manage a small smile, exhausted but relieved to be alive another day. Tomorrow, it begins all over again, until the entire vessel is reduced to shards and scraps. But the ships keep coming. Many arrive under suspicious circumstances, like a cruise liner that suspiciously changed its registry weeks before docking on the beach, or a tanker that reported mechanical failure and ended up sold for demolition at a fraction of its real value. Each arrival is a testament to a global trade that thrives on loopholes. The men who tear these ships apart have little sense of the political and corporate maneuvering that led them here. They see only the rusted walls in front of them, the next cut they have to make, and the persistent hope that the steel plate won't shift unexpectedly and crush them. For outsiders who witness the spectacle for the first time, the scale can be overwhelming. Towering hulls loom like decaying skyscrapers, the sea swirling with debris, the air thick with fumes. Photographs and videos barely capture the magnitude or the tension that hangs in the salt-tinged wind. And yet, there is a sort of grim fascination in watching the slow, methodical destruction of something that was once an emblem of global commerce or tourism. Perhaps that fascination arises from knowing how many stories took place on these ships, a lifetime of voyages reduced to scrap in a matter of months. In the global conversation about consumerism and sustainability, Gdani stands as a glaring example of what happens when profit outstrips principle. There is an uneasy sense that no matter how many treaties are signed, the machine of international shipping will continue to churn out more and more vessels. Once they're obsolete, they're shuffled off to distant beaches, out of sight and out of mind for most of the world. Only when a major disaster strikes, or when sensational headlines surface, does the public remember that such places exist. Then, predictably, attention wanes, funding for investigations dries up, and the wheel of exploitation turns again. Experts debate possible reforms, requiring ships to be dismantled in fully equipped dry docks, enforcing real-time environmental monitoring, mandating fair wages and robust safety gear. Some of these ideas have been partially implemented in advanced shipbreaking facilities in Europe and Turkey. But scaling those measures to Gdani is a challenge that goes beyond technicalities. It demands political will, economic restructuring, and a cultural shift in how we view labor rights in the developing world. Whether that will ever come to pass remains an open question, particularly when financial incentives for the status quo are so high. A few activists and nonprofits attempt to pierce the veil of secrecy. They document working conditions, photograph accidents, and interview survivors. Their reports paint a grim picture, but also spark hope for incremental change. International bodies might levy fines or blacklist companies that repeatedly violate environmental or labor standards. Yet the labyrinth of shell companies and re-registrations makes real accountability elusive. And on the beach, men continue to arrive from distant towns, each with the same dream of earning enough to feed their families. Some watchers argue that the entire shipping industry must be overhauled, from how ships are built, with safer, more environmentally friendly materials, to how they are scrapped, ensuring the cost of dismantling is factored into the vessel's life cycle from the start. But this is a mammoth undertaking, requiring global cooperation, something historically in short supply. Shipping is big business, tied to the fortunes of countries reliant on trade. Powerful lobbies defend their interests, often shaping regulations to their advantage. The Hong Kong Convention might look like progress on paper, but skeptics warn that without strict enforcement and genuine transparency, it could simply become another veneer of respectability, letting unscrupulous companies carry on as usual. Of course, not all yard owners are equal. Some genuinely try to provide safety gear, training, and better wages. But the overall system remains stacked against the average worker. Even basic healthcare can be inaccessible. If someone is injured and needs specialized treatment, they might have to travel hours to a hospital, often with no financial support from the employer. For injuries that require lengthy rehabilitation, the prospect of returning to physically demanding shipbreaking work is slim. And in an environment with few alternative careers, many feel they have no choice but to keep going until they can't go any longer. Meanwhile, nature bears its own scars. Beaches where ships have been dismantled for decades accumulate layers of debris, metal filings, paint chips, and chemical residues, forming a toxic layer that remains even after the tides wash away the surface scraps. Local fishermen speak of reduced catches and strange discolorations in the water. In some areas, the seabed is littered with sunken fragments that never made it to recycling, an underwater graveyard of rust. Marine biologists worry about the long-term effects on coral reefs and the broader ocean ecosystem, but systematic research is limited. Funding for environmental studies is sparse, and the government has other priorities. And so, Gdani continues as it has for years, a global dumping ground for ships that have outlived their purpose. Each new arrival prompts a flurry of activity as yard managers negotiate prices with brokers, arrange the beaching process, and assign crews to begin the teardown. Workers line up, tool in hand, prepared to face the dangers in exchange for a wage. Over the course of weeks or months, the vessel is gradually transformed into pieces that can be sold or melted down. By the time the last steel plate is removed and the final chunk of hull is hauled away, there's little evidence of the ship's former grandeur. Only the battered shoreline and the men's scarred lungs remain as witnesses to a process fueled by profit and sustained by oblivion. With every new condemnation by activists or expose in the media, the yard owners and shipping magnates issue bland assurances that conditions will improve. But after the cameras leave, life usually returns to normal. The real question is whether the looming wave of new regulations, especially the Hong Kong Convention, will finally bring some measure of progress, or if it will merely provide a fresh coat of paint on an industry whose foundation is inherently precarious. Few on the ground hold their breath for a miracle. They have shifts to work, families to feed, and an unspoken acceptance that the next accident could be just one misstep away. Meanwhile, thousands of miles from Gdani, in boardrooms and shipping lanes, new vessels are launched with gleaming hulls and optimistic fanfare, all set to traverse the globe. Eventually, They too will age, become outdated, and be sold off for a final profit. When that day comes, the cycle will repeat. The question for those who witness the slow, destructive ballet on Gdani's shores is whether enough will have changed to spare future workers the tragedies and exploitation of the past. Or will the industry's relentless drive for profit once again overshadow the value of human life, dooming yet another generation to labor under toxic skies for a pittance? As each new ship creeps toward the beach, rust-streaked and looming, the men who stand ready with their torches and hammers are left to wonder if they're dismantling these mighty vessels, or if, slowly but surely, these ships are dismantling them.